Hi everyone, Dr. Hall here, continuing on. So now that we've talked about how gametes are produced through that process of meiosis and how we make haploid cells so that when 23 chromosomes from a sperm come together with 23 chromosomes from an oocyte, we have a new combination of 46 chromosomes arranged in 23 pairs. So we're going to pick up at that moment where sperm meets egg called fertilization and then follow it through all of fetal development. So this process of fertilization through fetal development is also known as pregnancy, okay, in terms of if you are the person in whom this is happening. So let's break this down and take a look at what's happening. So millions of sperm are contained in a single ejaculate. So on the order of 200 to 500 million sperm, each one genetically distinct from the other, are released in a single ejaculate. And so they have to then swim up through the vagina, through the cervix, into the uterus, and out into the fallopian tubes. Because you'll remember that the oocyte, after being ovulated, has been kind of into the fallopian tubes by the fimbriae, and then whoosh, whoosh, wafted by the cilia of the cells lining the fallopian tubes down toward the uterus. But she hasn't made it all the way down to the uterus yet. In fact, the oocyte is only going to live for about 6 to 12 hours after ovulation. So the sperm need to already be there and waiting in the fallopian tubes, or they need to get there pretty quickly, because if not fertilized within 6 to 12 hours, the oocyte will die. And then the corpus luteum will regress and progesterone levels will fall and you will have a period. But anyway, so millions of sperm are going to arrive. They have to swim up and look for the egg. Of course, they don't know which side, which fallopian tube she's in, right? So half go one way, half go the other way. And then perhaps one lucky sperm is going to be able to penetrate the egg. And in order to do that, it's going to use the enzymes in its acrosomal cap to burrow through a protective layer that is surrounding the oocyte. Once inside, then, its 23 chromosomes are going to merge with the oocyte's 23 chromosomes and create this new cell, this diploid cell with 46 chromosomes called the zygote. And this is a really remarkable moment because it is the first time ever that this exact genetic combination has ever existed before. It's brand new. So now we have a zygote. The zygote then, so let me see if I can use my little pen here. So we had ovulation, there's our oocyte. Fertilization occurs. Here are the two pronuclei coming together to form the zygote. So that zygote now is a single cell, just one cell. It's relatively large. It's almost the size of a pinhead, so it's about 1 millimeter in diameter. So you can see it with the naked eye, but just barely. That one cell is going to have to go on and to produce all of the cells of the baby eventually, as well as all of the cells that make up much of the placenta and the umbilical cord and the amniotic sac. So in order to do that, first of all, it's being wafted down by the cilia, whoosh, 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 right? We want to move it down into the uterus because the fallopian tube is not equipped to handle a pregnancy. It doesn't have the endometrial lining, and it certainly cannot expand to the size of a watermelon. So we got to get down into the uterus. And that one cell is going to end up forming all parts of the fetus and the placenta, the umbilical cord, amniotic sac, like I mentioned. So what it's going to start to do is make exact copies of itself first via mitosis. So it's going to start making exact copies of itself. It's going to go from being one cell to being 2 cells, and then 4 cells, and then 8 cells, and then a ball of cells. And then it's going to, around days 7 to 10, it's going to reach the uterus and it's going to burrow into the endometrium. It doesn't just attach, it doesn't just land, it actually burrows into the endometrium, and that is called implantation. So once it implants in the endometrium, cells are now differentiating. So about half the cells are going to become future placenta, umbilical cord, amniotic sac, and the other half of the cells are now the inner cell mass. They're going to go on to actually form the embryo or the developing child. So the baby placenta cells now start producing HCG, which, as we talked about before, is the hormone that says, oh, we got one, we're pregnant. It tells the corpus luteum, therefore, to keep making progesterone, and that helps maintain that nice, thick, juicy endometrium to support and nourish the developing embryo, right? We don't want to have a period now, right? We don't want this to be lost. We want to keep it. And of course, HCG is the hormone that turns a pregnancy test positive. It is normally only produced in pregnancy. There are a few, there are some testicular cancers that sometimes produce HCG, but it is only normally produced in a pregnancy. So this is a graphic that kind of goes through this whole process. It's a little overwhelming when you look at it first, so let's go through it together. First of all, we have our oocyte, our mature oocyte that's been released for ovulation. Sperm then come, and one of them, looks like this guy, makes it in. Those two pronuclei, each with 23 chromosomes, fuse, and now we have a new cell with 46 chromosomes called a zygote. That zygote is then going to undergo mitosis, and so here, right, we have 4 cells, and here we have lots of cells, and it just forms these balls of cells. And during this entire process, it's being wafted down through the fallopian tube toward the uterus. What we see happening here is the first differentiation. So what we can see here is that ball of cells starts to hollow out, and we have this outer circle of cells, outer sphere actually, and then we have this inner clump of cells here. So the outer cells, the cells that are kind of forming the shell of this ball of cells, those are the cells that are going to become placenta, amniotic sac, and umbilical cord. That clump of cells is called the inner cell mass, and that's going to end up forming the embryo. Weren't we cute as babies? So we're just these little clumps of cells. But that's kind of the first fork in the road where these cells that were absolutely all identical to each other now start expressing different genes, so they become different types of cells. So we call that differentiation because now they're behaving differently from each other because different genes are being expressed. So as we look over here, so then implantation is going to happen, and so this blastocyst now has burrowed into the endometrium. The blastocyst is this name of this ball of cells with a clump at one end. And then that inner cell mass, that clump at one end, is going to form a 3-layered disc. I don't know if you can really see it right there. There's a 3-layered disc. And that little disc, that embryonic disc, you can also see it here, that was you. That was you a long, long time ago. That 3-layered disc is then going to curl into a tube. The outer portion of that tube is going to end up becoming your skin, as well as your nervous system. The middle layer of that tube is going to become your muscles and your bones. And the innermost layer of that tube is going to become the inside lining of your reproductive tract and your respiratory tract. So if you think about it, we're all actually a tube within a tube within a tube, right? Our outermost tube, open at one end with the mouth and the other end with your anus, is made of skin. And then our middle tube is our meat cage, right? Our muscles and bones. And then our inner tube is our guts, right? So from your mouth down through your whole alimentary canal, right? And then out the anus. So we're just a tube within a tube within a tube. It's very humbling. All right. So here's a great video that I'm going to ask you to watch that animates this process of fertilization, and they do a really nice job, so definitely watch it. There will be questions on the quiz based on it. So now we move into embryogenesis. You already know Genesis means creation, so this is creation of the embryo. And so embryogenesis is when we go from that tube within a tube within a tube, and we start to actually lay down all the major rough drafts, blueprints, outlines of the organ systems, right? So all of the beginnings of the major organs, the liver, the heart, the eyes, the ears, all those things start to get produced. Oh, cat. All right, so they're not functional, but they've at least all been started in the embryo. So at the end of 8 weeks after fertilization, which is 10 weeks after the last menstrual period, we have finished embryogenesis and creation of the embryo. And so you can see on the left-hand image here, that's kind of what we start off with at the beginning. Let me just show you a few things. This is the, oh, that doesn't show up. Let me try something else. This is the optic pit, which will become the eye. Here's the spine, and there is a tail at the beginning that gets absorbed later. We can also see, this is a very early picture, that the liver and the heart end up forming initially kind of, oh, don't step on that, end up forming outside before the tube has completely closed, and then they eventually move in. And you can also see limb buds. So this is the beginning of the upper extremity, and oh, get down. And this is the beginning of the lower extremity. They start like these little flippers on the sides. All right, so that's a larger image of what we're seeing here. And then during the course of embryogenesis, all these organs begin to form. And by the end of embryogenesis, 8 weeks after fertilization or 10 weeks after the last menstrual period, then we have something that looks vaguely human, right? So now our finished embryo, we've got most of the major structures in place. They are not yet fully functional, but we've at least started them. We have a rough draft in place. So the next phase of pregnancy then, from 4 months through 9 months, right? So from the end of embryogenesis until birth, it's now called the fetus. So what was the embryo is now called the fetus and will be until it's born, and then it's an infant or a baby. So during fetal development then, what's happening is we're putting all the finishing touches on those organ systems. So we're fully maturing them, we're getting them up to functional capacity, we're growing them. And so it's just kind of filling in all the details, dotting the I's and crossing the T's to get everything fully matured and functional before you're born. During this entire time, the fetus, or the embryo for that matter, of course, it can't breathe, it can't eat, right? Because A, it's inside the uterus, and B, it doesn't have functional organ systems to actually breathe or eat with. So it needs to get all of its nutrients, and it needs to get all of its oxygen from the mother's blood supply. And it's going to do this through the placenta. So in this upper image, we can see we have an embryo or early fetus here, and this is the placenta, and they are linked with the umbilical cord here. So your belly button, your umbilicus, is where your umbilical cord actually entered into your body, and it's in connection with blood vessels inside your body. So what's happening is that blood from the fetus or the embryo is traveling out through the umbilical cord into the placenta, where diffusion allows nutrients and oxygen from the mother's bloodstream to move across into the infant's bloodstream, and wastes from the fetus's bloodstream will move out of the fetal blood and into the maternal blood, also via diffusion, right? Because of course the baby's kidneys aren't really working yet either, or the liver. So here's a close-up view of that end of that umbilical cord as it comes into the placenta. And there is a membrane here that kind of covers these capillaries. These are fetal capillaries, basically, in the fetal part of the placenta. There is a membrane here, and it sits in these pools of maternal blood. And that allows for that diffusion of nutrients, gases, and wastes to occur. Keep in mind the placenta also, as we talked about earlier, has an endocrine function. It is also producing hormones. So the one we talked about is progesterone. So as the pregnancy continues, the placenta matures and starts to be able to make its own progesterone so that the corpus luteum doesn't have to keep doing it. And so that progesterone then sustains the ongoing maintenance of that endometrial lining so that we can have a nice, good, well-supplied placenta. So far, we have talked about kind of some introductory genetics, how chromosomes are packages of DNA. Genes are segments of that DNA molecule that code for information. We as humans have 46 chromosomes. We're designated as 2N or diploid, and they're arranged in 23 pairs. One of each pair we got from a sperm, the other we got from an oocyte. Gametes, however, need to have half as many, 23 chromosomes or haploid, so we're going to use meiosis to produce them. The 4 steps I want you to know for meiosis are duplication, where you make an exact copy of everything, crossover, where they kind of say goodbye and exchange a few genes with each other to mix things up, and then the first and second divisions, which are what allow us to have at the end 4 cells in the case of sperm, each with half, or in the case of the oocyte, we only end up with 1 oocyte and 2 polar bodies that then degenerate. The sperm is a very specialized cell, with the head having the nucleus with its 23 chromosomes, the acrosome with the enzyme to burrow into the oocyte's outer protective covering, a midpiece with mitochondria to power its ability to swim, and then the tail or flagellum so that it can swim. For fertilization, the sperm is going to use those acrosomal enzymes, burrow into the oocyte. The nucleus, or pronucleus as it's often called, of the sperm will fuse with the pronucleus of the oocyte, and now we have a brand new cell with a genetic combination never before seen. So we are now a diploid cell with 46 chromosomes, the zygote. That one zygote then is going to go on to form all of the cells of the fetus and the placenta and the umbilical cord. So it's going to undergo mitosis, rapidly multiplying, making copies of itself as it moves down the fallopian tubes via the action of the cilia, whoosh, whoosh, down to the uterus. Cells start to differentiate into placenta versus embryo, and we implant. It burrows into the endometrial lining. Then we start forming all the basic organ systems through the process of embryogenesis, which occurs in the first few months of pregnancy. And then from the 4th month onward, it's further growth and maturation of those organ systems through a process called fetal development. And then we also talked about how the placenta is an interface between the fetal and maternal blood via that umbilical cord, and that's what provides all of the nutrients and oxygen for the developing fetus, as well as takes away all the wastes and carbon dioxide produced by the cellular activity of the fetus. So we'll pick up on lecture 38, talking about childbirth and then contraception or birth control.